The man responsible for the revolution of 1911 was Sun Yat-sen. That looks like Sun, but the Chinese pronounce it Sun Yat-sen. And he was the son of a peasant who grew up to become a doctor, and then went around to England and Japan, among other places, trying to get some ideas for how to bring about change in China. He believed he knew how to do it, so he wanted to copy the West, so he could gather together a bunch of revolutionaries around him. And he overthrew the emperor. The year was 1911. And he set himself up as the head of a republic, or he called it the Republic of China. Now, as is the case with most revolutions, no matter how well intentioned, most revolutions throughout history have failed. The American Revolution in the 1700s was an exception, but most of the time people wind up worse off than they were before, or under a more autocratic government than had been before. So for the most part, revolution does not work. I want to digress here a little bit, like your book does, and talk about this same time between 1911 and 1918. During a period of about 8 years, 7 years inclusive, 8 years inclusive, 5 empires came to an end. The empires didn't come to an end, but actually the dynasties that ruled them came to an end. The royal family of the Chinese was deposed first in 1911. Then came World War I, and World War I ended the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire completely ceased to exist as a nation. The Russian Empire came to an end. The Tsarist family was overthrown in 1917. The Austrian Empire and German Empire both came to an end in 1918. At least the Austrian royal family was deposed, and the German royal family was deposed. Now, Austria and Germany remain nations. But all these 5 empires came to a close within a few years of each other. By the time it was over with, there weren't very many emperors left. There was still an emperor in Ethiopia, and the Japanese, to this day, Japan still has its emperor. But there weren't very many nations left that had the title emperor. All right. In the case of Sun Yat-sen, he had to abdicate, or he had to step down. A general came in with an army and took over, and he set himself up as a ruler. And Sun Yat-sen's rule came to an end. But at least China was in name a republic. Now, where this is going to lead is, by 1949, China was going to cease to be a republic. 1949 was the year China ceased to be a republic. Actually, I'll take it back. They still call themselves a republic. But in 1949, the communists were to take over. And again, it's debatable whether you can call the communist revolution of 1949 a success. So the Republic of China, such as it was, lasted from 1911 to 1949. And it was beset by turmoil and problems all the way through from the beginning, and never did really get going. Now, a movie came out called The Last Emperor in 1987. I thought about going to see it, but I'm not that much to go see movies. So of course, I've seen a lot more of them with my children growing up, and they want to see some. But, the movie entitled The Last Emperor was about the last Chinese emperor, who was a boy emperor. And when when the Chinese boy emperor was deposed, the Chinese empire came to an end. Now, one point I want to make We're about to talk about Japan. This chapter is about the Far East, China and Japan. Talk to any Chinese who knows his Chinese history, and he'll tell you the problem with China, they were steeped in tradition and not willing to learn from the West. Japan, on the other hand, realized that the West had a lot to offer them, and they felt threatened by the device of the West, so they said if we're to survive, we must copy the West. Japan, being much bigger, didn't think they had to copy the West, so Japan copied the West. China tried to maintain its old ways, with the result that Japan forged ahead and was for many years become the chief power in the far eastern part of the world. The economy, the problem that China had in becoming an industrial giant or becoming an industrial nation was they were steeped in tradition, and the tradition in China was the ideal occupation as being a farmer. Now, we in the West think the ideal occupation is being something else besides a farmer and tend to look down on a farmer as being one of the lowest of occupations. But the Chinese looked on the farmer as being the highest of occupations, and this tended to discourage the Chinese from industrializing or getting involved in scientific discoveries, or well, it just simply meant that they tried to maintain the old ways, the old traditions. With the result, they fell behind. Nevertheless, slowly and gradually, China forged ahead toward industrialization, but it was to take almost 100 years. Now today, China is becoming something of an industrial country, but they were very slow at moving. And a lot of historians will say that it was the Westerners who eventually made inroads into China. Vladimir Lenin, the Marxist who took over Russia, said no, what Westerners actually did was hurt China more than help them, and the Western imperialists were the Westerners were the reason for China's big downfall. Had it not been for the West, China might have gone forward and prospered. But the standard view is the West actually did a lot to elevate or move China along the path towards industrialization. Women, your book shows a picture of two women with bound feet, which was a tradition in China at the time, and it said about this time in the late 1800s, probably half of your Chinese women had bound feet. And I mean, folks, this is a term your book uses. It says women's status was that of useless sex objects, and again, I'm looking right on page 649. This was what they were, but they were trying to come out of that, and many of them began to get jobs in factories, even though the foot binding obviously hindered them there. The practice of foot binding was outlawed by the communists when they took over. The communists took over in 1949. I understand that foot binding was outlawed in 1950. The authors visited China in 1980, and they said they still saw a few women with bound feet. As far as I know, the practice is pretty much discontinued. Women began to be educated more, and this trend has continued to this day. Your book talks about Christian missionaries opening girls' schools. I mean, I look at the top page 651, and one of the women who was over there to help open a girls' school was Billy Graham. Was a woman who became the wife of Billy Graham. Actually, her parents, not her, her parents opened up a missionary school, a Christian missionary school in China, and this girl grew up to become the wife of Billy Graham. Again, your book says very few women were educated, but they set the example for girls to become more educated later. All right, so much for China for now. Just remember the big problem they had, they fell behind because they were steeped in tradition and did not want to change. And contrast, now Japan. At the beginning of the 1800s, Japan had a policy of we're going to lock ourselves in and lock foreigners out. And foreigners, they'll do nothing to us but hurt us. We don't want them in here. We like our islands. We like them. We want to have only us on our islands. And folks, that is still true in the year 2014. The Japanese generally do not encourage foreigners to move in and settle in. They don't like immigrants. And, but at least they'll allow foreign influences in. But at the time period we're talking about, the start of the 1800s, they didn't want anybody in. And one time an American ship got blown off course and the sailors were captured and held for a while, and it took some intense negotiations to get their release. But finally, in 1853, I believe, or thereabouts, 1852, an American president, a president we've largely forgotten about, a president we don't even think about hardly anymore, named Millard Fillmore. I doubt that many of you even heard of him, but if you look on the list of presidents, he's there. But anyway, the most notable thing President Millard Fillmore did was he sent Commodore Perry to Japan with a fleet. And this fleet carried along a telegraph and a miniature train with a real engine. In other words, they could lay out the track and get this train to go around in circles like trains do. And a whole bunch of other gadgets that Westerners had. His name was there. The Commodore's name, the man who commanded the fleet, was Perry. And he went under the orders of President Millard Fillmore. And he came with his big ships, which somewhat startled the Japanese. And your book shows a painting of the Japanese rowing out their smaller boats to meet them. But the Japanese were highly impressed with what they saw. Hey, this telegraph can send messages all the way across from one end of one of our islands to the other in a second or less than a second. They were highly impressed. The railroad was a very fast means of transportation that could carry a lot. Again, the Japanese were impressed. The Japanese decided to open up trade with the United States, and they began to do what the Japanese have done best for the last 180 or so years. They began to copy the West. Now, the Japanese are really great copiers, but they don't just copy verbatim. When they copy something, they try to copy and improve it. And they began to copy Western dress, even Western baseball. And they played baseball in Japan, and some of their players have made our major league teams. And some of our major league players have gone there. They began to set up their own railroads, build steamships, industrialize, and the rest of the world began to take notice. Their women began to work the factories, and in fact, your authors make the statement that without the help of the women, it's likely Japan could not have industrialized as it did. Now, one reason Japan simply could not afford to remain steeped in tradition is Japan does not have a lot of good farmland. Didn't then and still doesn't. So this forced the Japanese people to engage in other pursuits besides farming, even though every society does have its farmers. But Japanese began to westernize, and then they began to copy the West in another way. They began to become an imperialist. I'm looking at page 656, joining the imperialist club. They set their sights on some of the islands off the coast of Japan, off the islands off the coast of China. They took Taiwan from China. Then they fought China over Korea. The war is called the Sino-Japanese War. The Sino-Japanese War is where Japan and China clashed over the island of Korea, over the peninsula of Korea, and it showed China to be a very weak nation. Nobody had realized how weak, but basically the Japanese armies, with their better equipment, better rifles, better artillery, and better ships, just mopped up the Chinese military and showed China to be a weak nation and showed Japan to be a strong nation. And again, the rest of the world took notice. Japan then began to have dreams of setting themselves up as, they called it, they were going to be set up as the empire on which the sun rises. In other words, that when the sun comes up, it'll come up on Japan first, and Japan will be the master of all the eastern part of the world, with all the eastern part of the world, including China and Korea and Vietnam and the Philippines, all supplying Japan with raw materials. The Japanese would work these raw materials into finished products and then sell the finished products to the other parts of that part of the world. And they were going to build up their empire. And they began. The problem was Russia stood in their way, and later the United States would stand in their way. Anyway, Japan got Russia off its back. In 1905, the Russo-Japanese War basically, the war consisted mostly of one battle. The Japanese made a sneak attack on the Russian Port Arthur and defeated the Russian Navy at Port Arthur. And the battle was significant, and it was the first time in modern times that a European country had been defeated in a war by an Asian country, or by a country that was looked on as being outside of Europe. Basically, it was the first time in modern times that some outsiders had defeated a major European country. The Russians were very humiliated. Now, when I was talking about a sneak attack on Port Arthur, does anybody know enough about history to know that when the Japanese were to attempt another Navy sneak attack? Pearl Harbor, thank you. And Pearl Harbor, see, they had done it in 1905 and gotten away with it. Well, about 36 years later, they did the same thing to the United States when they made a sneak attack on our Navy base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, which I will be talking about later. But the difference was, they defeated the Russians in 1905, but by attacking the United States, provoked a war with the United States, which they could not win. But anyway, they showed the other nations of the world, particularly the African and Asian nations, that, hey, European countries can be defeated. And eventually Vietnam was to take notice and defeat the French, and then eventually Vietnam was to defeat the United States also. But the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 again put Japan at the top of the world militarily. Well, not the top of the world, but they felt like they're at the top of the world militarily. Now, Russia had built a railway, which is still in operation, a 4,000-mile-long railway from Moscow across Siberia to the port at Port Arthur. But the railroad was beset with problems. Again, the Russians have always had problems with their equipment breaking down or their stuff not working very well. So they tried to get their army over to across the railway to Japan quickly, but they couldn't. Breakdowns occurred along the way. So again, the Japanese had a smaller army, but the Japanese were right there on the scene, and the Russians were 3,000 or 4,000 miles away. All right. The Japanese then began to conquer more territory. They annexed Korea in 1908. When the Koreans protested the seizure, the Japanese moved in and killed thousands of Koreans. The United States went along with Japan's program at first. But they said the United States, in effect, said to Japan, now listen, we have the Philippines. If you'll respect our sovereignty in the Philippines, we'll let you have the territory you've conquered other than the Philippines. The Japanese agreed to it, so the United States initially sided with Japan. Now I say initially, eventually Japan was to take the Philippines from the United States for a few years. And eventually Japan was to fight a war with the United States. But initially, Japan had the friendship of the United States and the approval of the United States. All right.